Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is going to be relatively small compared to previous chapters, especially last chapter, Chapter 7. It was really big, talking about the Cold War. And the bulk of your learning that is going to occur in Chapter 8 is going to come from the assignment. It's just 8 questions this week, but a lot of good reading in the textbook and a lot of good opportunities for you to reflect on modern liberalism evolving. So, yeah, that's what Chapter 8 is about. To what extent is modern liberalism continuing to this day to evolve? Talks about a couple of different things, and we are going to focus today on a few. One of them being environmentalism. So environmentalism has its roots in the 1800s, but has really come to the forefront today. And simply put, environmentalism is advocating for the protection of the environment, and that has kind of changed over time. In the past, it may have been saying we need a national park, we need to protect this area, to moving towards saving the planet from human made climate change. Um, yeah, it's definitely changed over time. And it has led to some political bodies to enshrine the right to a healthy environment alongside the principles of modern liberalism, one of them being the UN Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, says that everyone has the right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, improving all aspects of environmental and industrial hygiene. Here in Canada, the Quebec Charter of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to live in a healthy environment in which biodiversity is preserved to the extent and according to the standards provided by law. In Canada, especially in the past 10 or so years, there's been a push to kind of have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system to address some of the scientific research that is coming out of extreme weather events, global temperatures, and how carbon may have a significant impact on climate change. And because of this, most political parties have something about environmentalism, carbon tax, carbon capture within their political platforms. And some of them believe that the best thing to do is to tax the people who are using the most carbon. Some people believe that we shouldn't tax the people who are using carbon, and we should rather do other things. For example, reforestation or planting trees is one of the best ways to capture carbon that we use. There's also a cap and trade system, and that's basically a carbon tax that only exists for big companies and not individuals. So carbon emission reduction have become key political points. How will political parties deal with the environment and still have economic growth and have the least effect on citizens' pocketbook? Neoconservatism, kind of the opposite of progressivism, and you could argue would be against a lot of environmentalism. Um, and it's a little bit confusing to nail down exactly what a conservative is. I really like this quote: when two neoconservatives meet, they are more likely to argue with one another than confer or conspire. Many neoconservatives were former liberals, where liberal policies have failed in terms of especially economic and political freedom. Some aspects of neoconservatism challenge modern liberalism principles and favor a return to classical liberalism. So, as I had mentioned in previous chapters, whenever you hear the word conservative, almost always think of like progress or change is too much. We need to go back to our traditional values, or we need to stop changing. And neoconservatives are liberals that say, hey, I don't really like modern liberalism. I would prefer if we return to classical liberalism. And then other neoconservatives challenge both classical and modern. For example, sometimes um, religious beliefs and views get connected to conservatism and neoconservatism. And some of those don't align with classical or modern liberalism at all. So, neoliberalism emerged in the US during the 50s and 60s. And they really didn't like the civil rights movement. In particular, they didn't like affirmative action. And affirmative action is basically saying, hey, we did some really poor things in the past, and there's a lot of discrimination that still occurs today. So let's do some things, some action, some affirmative action to try to go against this discrimination. So, one example is hiring more people of color, or more women, or more people from gender diverse communities. Because in the past and even today, they face discrimination in terms of being hired or in the workplace. So, the detente between the USSR and the USA, a lot of neoconservatives saw that as weak, and really wanted the US to go back to actively promoting and fighting for capitalism and democracy, and against the spread of communism. Neoconservatism grew in popularity in the 1980s. It was reflected in the economic, social, and foreign policies of Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher. Cold War had a lot to do with this. Neoconservatives, in terms of economic policy, it'll look a lot like laissez-faire capitalism and classical liberalism. Economic growth is stimulated by cutting taxes. Government involvement in economic markets should be limited. Lower taxes and a free market to create conditions that resemble classical liberal economic policy, as well as evidence of international influence, like the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. Both these organizations promote free trade, reduce tariffs or taxes internationally, concessions regulations regarding government involvement. Milton Friedman, a lot of neoconservatives like Milton Friedman because he promoted classical liberal policies, minimizing government involvement in the economy, reducing government regulations of all kinds, and he opposed government programs like public education, public health, and public housing. These should be left to the individual. Neoconservatism and foreign policy. A lot of them believe patriotism is good and should be encouraged. World government was not a good idea, such as the UN. It will lead to tyranny. A large country's interests extend beyond borders, so you need a strong military. And democratic capitalism is the preferable system and should be promoted internationally. Neoconservatives and morality. Lots of them have traditional views about social views. Concerned about the demise of the traditional moral culture, tend to be suspicious of countercultural movements, and influenced by the Christian right, curtailing abortion, allowing prayer in school, and teaching creationism in science. Civil rights movements. As mentioned, a lot of neoconservatives didn't like civil rights movements because it was a big change in the civil dynamics of a country. and in the United States between the 1950s and 60s that worked to extend rights to marginalized members of society. Often these often these struggles aimed not only for legal and civil rights, but also for respect, dignity, and economic and social equality for all. So, positive and negative freedoms, your textbook touches on it a bit. And every so often, the diploma will throw in a question about positive and negative freedoms. So, a negative freedom is a freedom from something, okay? And a positive freedom is a freedom of something. So, negative freedom would be a freedom from government intervention, right? A positive freedom is something to be a freedom of. So the slide is a little bit wrong. I will need to fix that, right? Freedom of association, freedom of conscience and religion are all positive freedoms, whereas freedom from is a negative freedom. Okay, so if I said freedom from discrimination, that's a negative freedom. Whereas a positive freedom would be freedom of um, mobility, the freedom to move, right? I could word it differently and it could be a negative freedom. Freedom from being stopped to move. That's a positive freedom and a negative freedom. Last slide for me is on egalitarianism. And it's basically the political principle that holds that all people should be treated as equals and allowed at equal civil, social, political, and economic rights under the law. Okay, that is all for me for chapter 8. I hope you enjoy doing the chapter 8 assignment. And with that, unit 2 is finished. So after you finish the chapter 8 assignment, you will see in the online course a study section for unit 2, which is chapters 3 to 8. And then you'll also see the ability to start working on your Unit 2 essay, as well as a spot for your Unit 2 exam. So good luck with all of that stuff. And as always, if you need any help, please reach out. Okay. Good luck.